Hey, what's up everybody? It's Rutech. Today I'll be talking about the best $1,000 gaming PC that you can build in 2022. Alright, so the first order of business is unboxing the motherboard, the Asus Prime B560MA. The items we'll need from this box are only the motherboard and the IO shield. Everything else, put it in a Ziploc bag in case you need it later. Take the motherboard out of its bag and place it directly on top of its box. Now it's time to install the CPU, the Intel i5-11400F. This is a super capable CPU that can handle basically all modern demanding tasks. Unhinge and lift this lever right here so that you can lift up the CPU bracket. Now take a look at your 11400F and locate the golden triangle on the bottom left. This will have to match up with the circle on the bottom left of the CPU socket. It's a perfect fit. All you really have to do is wiggle it around once it's in there to make sure it's properly secured, and then lower the bracket and secure it in place by pushing the lever back into its original position. And then you can move the socket cover out of the way. Now it's time to install the RAM, the Team T-Force Delta RGB 2x8GB of 3000 MHz memory. I've always found Team T-Force RAM to be super reliable, and their RGB looks a lot better than other RAM sticks in the price range. The RAM needs to be installed in these light gray slots, not the black ones. Lower the retention clips and using your thumbs preferably, push the RAM sticks into their slots. You should hear a subtle click coming from both sides, which will let you know if you properly installed them. Now for the storage, the Crucial P2, which comes with 500 GB of NVMe SSD storage. Loosen these two screws to remove the M2 heatsink, and then carefully slide the M2 drive into its slot. Now since this is NVMe SSD storage, your overall Windows experience and load times for games will be super snappy. Now before you put the heatsink back, you do have to remove this sticker off of this thermal tape, and now you can put the heatsink back in its original position. And there's no need to tighten it super hard, just make sure the screws are nice and snug. Now it's time for the CPU cooler, the Arctic Freezer 7X. This is one of the cheaper CPU coolers, but man does it perform well, and boy does it look good. And trust me, there's a lot of cheap CPU coolers that do not look nearly as good as this one. You'll have a roughly 20 degrees Celsius difference from the stock cooler. So now let's get to installing the bracket. Make sure these clear plastic pieces are facing the inside, or are in the 1200 position. Once you've made sure of that, you can snap the bracket into place. And you'll know it's properly installed if there's no gap. And now for the retention pins. This is a pretty easy step. All you have to do is kind of just push them into these slots and they'll click in place. And we can't forget the cooler itself. Take off the plastic piece at the bottom and do your absolute best to not touch the pre-applied thermal paste. Now you have to make sure these two brackets right here are facing inwards. And once you've made sure of that, lower the cooler onto the processor in this exact orientation. Now with those brackets I was just talking about, slide them onto the tabs that are found on the sides of the retention ring. Now you will have to apply a little bit of pressure, don't be scared. The cooler is meant to apply a decent bit of pressure onto the CPU heat spreader. Now tighten the screws and try to alternate between the two. Don't tighten one all the way and then the other. Now locate the CPU fan connector, which should be coming out of the fan, and plug it into the header labeled CPU fan. And that's it for the motherboard. I'd say the challenging part is over. Now it's time to just put everything in the case. But first, let's remove this rear fan as it'll make things a lot easier, and we're gonna move it to the front later on. Before the motherboard comes the IO shield. There's no screws or anything to secure this into place, and I really wish there was, because with the IO shield, all you really do is apply pressure along the sides until it clicks into place. And sometimes it takes me a while. I have no idea why I haven't mastered installing IO shields yet. And while we're at it, also remove the back panel. And when that's done, flip the case onto its back. Now there are two standoff brackets that you do need to remove. You will need a pair of pliers to loosen them a little bit, and then you can do the rest with your fingers. And now we can finally install the motherboard. The best way to make sure it's properly aligned is to match up the IO with the IO shield. Now you should have received this bag with the case. In this bag, you'll find the motherboard screws. And on the top right, you can see exactly where you install these screws. Now go to the back side of the case and find this screw right here. This holds the little tab that will prevent your graphics card from sagging if you have a really long card, but we don't, so we can just get rid of it. Next up is the power supply, more specifically the EVGA 600BR 80+ bronze certified supply. Now when installing it, make sure the fan faces the bottom of the case. Otherwise, it's gonna get no airflow and, well, it's not the best idea. Once it's slid into position, you can use the 4 screws that came included with the power supply to fasten it into place. Now 600 watts of 80+ bronze certified power should definitely be more than enough to upgrade things like your CPU or graphics card or RAM in the future if you ever want to. And now for the fans. Firstly, you're going to want to remove this front panel. You kind of just tug on it a little bit and it comes off. And to secure the fans, we're going to be using this type of screw. These screws come with the RGB fans and the case. Now, as for this fan that came with the case, install it in the middle section of the intake bracket. Coming out of that fan will be this connector. It's called a Molex. You'll find an identical connector coming out of the power supply. Now, what you're going to do is just connect these two together. Now for the ARGB fans, the deepcool FC120 3-in-1 pack. Now these fans are a little hard to find in the US at the current moment, so I will provide a couple additional links to other great fans you can use in this build in the description. And when these become more available in the US, I'll of course add those links in. Anyway though, these are some really remarkable fans from Deepcool. They do a fantastic job at cooling, of course, and the ARGB lighting is really great. Also in the box, you'll find the screws, the extender, and the power cable. Now the first fan from this 3-pack, we're going to put right above the fan that we just installed. Do make sure that the cable that comes out of this fan is pointed towards the top and is routed through the cutout. And now you can put the front panel back. Turn the case around and locate the fan cable extender. Take the male side of this extender and attach it to the cable that's coming out of the fan that we just installed. Now take the female end of that connector and route it through this top right cutout. We're going to be connecting that to our next fan, which as you can see has a connector for that cable we just routed. Now you can go ahead and plug it into the side of the fan and then install the fan with the ribbing facing upwards and the logo facing downwards. And our third and final ARGB fan is going to go in the back. Facing this direction, the logo should be facing the CPU cooler. And don't forget to attach the cable coming out of the top fan to this one we're about to install. This should leave us with one last connector coming out of the back fan. Go ahead and route it through the top left cutout. This we're going to connect to the male 6-pin connector. This new cable you'll find in the box that came with the fans. Coming out of the power supply will be a SATA power connector. Should look like this. It'll attach to the male SATA connector that comes out of the fan power cable. And it should look something like this once completed. Also coming out of that fan power cable, you'll find the ARGB connector. This we're gonna route through the middle bottom cutout so that we can connect it to the header labeled Add Gen 2.1. Be sure not to get it mixed up with the RGB header. And the last connector we're gonna look at coming out of this fan power cable is the 4-pin fan connector. Route it through the bottom corner cutout and plug it into the header labeled Chassis Fan 2. And be sure not to skip out on this step, otherwise the fans will be super loud. All right, so now we have this huge mess of cables. To make it easier, let's divide them into 2 groups, the cables that came with the power supply and the cables that came with the case. And we're gonna start by plugging in some power supply cables, starting with the CPU power cable. Route it through this top right cutout, plug it into this top right connector labeled ATX 12 volt. Next power cable coming out of the power supply is this big guy, the 24-pin power cable. Route this through the top middle cutout and ensure that the 4-pin is properly attached to the 20-pin. You will need to apply a little bit of pressure along the corners and the sides, and it will take time, but you'll know it's properly installed when there's no gap between the connectors. Now we're going to start dealing with the cables that came with the case, starting with the USB 3.0 cable. Put that through the bottom middle cutout and plug it into this USB 3.0 connector. Next up is the audio cable. It's pretty easy to find as it's the only cable with colored wires. Route it through this bottom right cutout and be sure to pay attention to the layout of the connector. The cable only goes in one way and you don't want to accidentally put it in wrong and have a bent pin. And now for the last set of cables, of course the cables that everyone dreads, the front panel connectors. All 3 of these will go through the middle bottom cutout and will be plugged in on the very bottom right of the motherboard. If you look at the top right of your screen, you can see what goes where. Blue meaning required and green meaning optional. And now for the part you've been waiting for, the graphics card, the RX 6600. Now it doesn't have to be this exact XFX model of the 6600. It can really be any 6600 that you like or you get your hands on. And if you don't get this exact XFX model, don't worry, the installation process for all graphics cards is exactly the same. As you'll find out in the benchmarking section of the video, this is a very, very capable graphics card that can handle all modern games at, of course, 1080p and 1440p. Before we install a graphics card, we first have to shift this bracket out of place and also remove the PCIe shields. Push down the PCIe retention clip, and now we can finally install our graphics card. Slowly push it into the PCI Express lane until you hear a subtle click coming from the retention clip. Now to secure the card in place, it'll take 2 of these types of screws. Be sure to lift and support the graphics with your other hand while you're installing these screws. And lastly, we can't forget to supply some extra power to the graphics card, so locate the PCIe power cable, which should be coming out of the power supply, route it through the bottom middle cutout, and plug it into the card with the clip facing upwards. And the PC is built. Now it's time to install and activate Windows and download some drivers. To install Windows, you'll want to get a USB drive that is at least 8 GB in size and plug it into another Windows device. And then on that computer, head over to Google, type in Windows 10 ISO, and click this Microsoft.com link right here, or just click the link in my description, and then click the button that says Download Tool Now. Once the executable file is downloaded, you can go ahead and run it, and when it's done getting things ready, make sure you click Accept. Then it'll get even more things ready, and when it's done with that, you'll want to select Create Installation Media and click Next. Ensure the edition is Windows 10 and the architecture is 64-bit. Click Next and then make sure you have USB flash drive selected. And then of course, select your flash drive. Click Next and then it'll start installing Windows 10 onto the flash drive. This could take a pretty long time, so just relax, wait until it installs. And once it does, remove it from your device, plug it into your new PC and boot it up. And when it boots up, it should bring you to this screen. Verify that all the selected information is correct and then click Next, and then click Install Now. It will then bring you to this page. Click I don't have a product key, as we'll be putting that in later. Select either Windows 10 Home or Pro, it doesn't really matter, and then click Next. Read absolutely every single word of the applicable notices and license terms 3 times over, and then click Accept and then Next. Then click Custom Install Windows Only, select the only drive that should be displayed, and then click Next. And now it will install Windows. Once that's finished, it'll restart itself and bring you to the Windows setup prompt, which is pretty simple. I don't think I have to walk you guys through how to put your name and password and all that stuff. And once you get past the setup prompt, you will of course be greeted by the classic Windows desktop, but you shouldn't forget to activate Windows. To do this, it's pretty easy. Just head over to digitalchillmart.com, a really trustworthy website that has some of the best Windows 10 and 11 prices. Choose either Windows 10 Pro or Home, whichever you chose when you were installing Windows 10. And at checkout, be sure to use coupon code RUTECH for a discount. When the activation code is emailed to you, go to the search bar on your new PC, type in activation, click activation settings, and click the button that says either enter product key or change product key. This is where you'll enter the code that you received from digitalchillmart.com. Now that Windows is activated, let's turn on XMP. Press the boot button and spam the F2 key until the BIOS screen pops up. Once it does, all you have to do is go to XMP and make sure it's set to enabled. Then go to the bottom right, click Save and Exit, and click OK. As for drivers, I'll have all of the necessary drivers that you need to download right when you boot to Windows in my description. Highlighted in blue are the drivers I recommend you install. And lastly, let's take a look at some 1080p and 1440p benchmarks. So the order for each game will be 1080p lowest settings, 1080p at highest settings, 1440p with lowest settings, and then 1440p with the highest settings. For the rest of the benchmarking segment, there will be no commentary, just some nice soothing music. I'll catch you guys in the outro. All right, and that wraps it up for today's build tutorial video. If you enjoyed the video, drop a like. Have any comments or questions, drop a comment below. And if you enjoy the content you're seeing, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching. Peace out.